Blessed is she who believed. Blessed is she who believed. We hear this story this morning from the Gospel of Luke, which we really only hear in this full-bodied way every 3 years. Couple things to state the obvious, but it is still important, is that this is one of those Gospels where it is all about women. Women are the central figures of the Gospel. Women are the ones that are telling us how God continues to live and move and work in the world. It doesn't happen that often. And if it happens, it certainly happens more in Luke than in the other Gospels. But I want us to imagine for a minute who Mary and Elizabeth are and what it is we have to learn from them today, how they might be speaking to us even on this day in 2021. Mary was a young girl. But what we know are people, as you study and read about her and you look at art, you see that many times she's with a book. You look and know that she was a person that read, she was a person that was of deep faith. And so when Gabriel came to visit her, she was surprised, of course. We can talk about angels coming to visit us, but when it actually happens, I would hope we would be surprised. I certainly would be, and a little terrified, but that's another sermon. Okay, so the Gabriel came and said to her, told her what was about to happen, and she said yes. And where we land today is after that part of the story. And so she said yes, and she packed up her things, and she headed to go be with Elizabeth. And that wasn't just around the corner. It was another thing I was reminded of this week. It wasn't just around the corner or up the street a bit. This was many, many miles away. Over hill and dale and rough terrain. We don't know if she went by herself. We don't know how Joseph felt about the fact that she just took off. We don't know anything. We don't know how she was feeling. We know nothing, except that she took off, and something within her was so determined to get to Elizabeth that she went to any length to do that. And she gets there and she stays for 3 weeks. Now remember, too, a couple things, that if she'd stayed home, everybody else hadn't been in on the angel call. So she very well could have been shamed or stoned or killed for being with child without being married, as she and Joseph weren't married yet. And so she knew she had said yes. What we know is that she was a person of faith, and she knew scripture, and she knew the ancient stories, and she knew that for some reason she could hear that she had actually been called to do this, but she went to somebody else. She went to Elizabeth, who also knew. There's a mutual knowing among them. Elizabeth had said is her cousin, but there's also, they share something that nobody else had shared. So that's where we land this morning, and we land in that place where Mary jumps in and lands in Elizabeth's arms, and Elizabeth just can't believe it. Have you ever had that kind of experience where maybe you prayed for something, or maybe even you had an inkling that something might happen, or that God may be kind of leaning in a certain direction, but when it actually happens, it's like, wow. It's like that affirmation of God's grace and God's life in the world, and God continuing to tell the story. It's one thing to think about it and wish for it and imagine it, but to have it manifest right in front of us. And so there's Elizabeth going, whoa, this ride is really going to happen. And she looks up and she sees Mary. She looks up and she sees Mary. Imagine how many questions Mary must have. Think about it. Think about how God continues to work in our lives, whether we're at the beginning of our life or whether we're towards the end. Remember, Elizabeth was a woman, an older woman. She had spent her whole life barren, wishing that she was able to have a child, and of course had since given that up. And laughed when was told she was with child, which I find very comforting. But here she is. Blessed she who believed. Yes, we also hear the words, blessed are you among women, and blessed is the fruit of your womb. But the blessing that we often forget is when Elizabeth says, blessed are you who believed. Because Mary could have walked like any of us do on any given day. When we feel called or moved by God in some way, and we say, thank you so much for thinking of me. Mary said, yes, I will. Why did she say yes? Number one, she said yes because it made sense. She was a woman of scripture. She was a woman of faith. She'd read and learned. And you know what else? She knew that this, when we hear the words of the Magnificat, which are familiar words, I hope, to some of you, but they echo back to words from Hannah. If we listen back in the Hebrew Bible, there is another prophet named Hannah who says things like, my heart rejoices in the Lord, familiar. Says things like, those who were hungry cease to be hungry. The Lord makes the poor rich, raises the poor from the dust. Makes you think perhaps Mary knew some of what God was coming to do. We hear the voices, the prophets, the women voices, which we don't hear very often. But Mary gives us the voices of Hannah, of Deborah, of Miriam. And this young girl stands on the shoulders and the stories of all of those that had come before her. And she tells the story this morning of what God is doing, what God has done, and blessed who she who believes what God is about to do. Where can we glean hope from any of this? Why does this matter except that it's for people like me, it's a fabulous story. I could go on forever. I won't, you're lucky. But God continues to speak through you and I. The United Church of Christ for years, I don't know if they're still using it, but their logo or their branding, what they would use would be, God is still speaking. And that's a great thing to remind ourselves. And how is it that Mary knew that from Hannah's words were also her words? At this time of year, we often think about we can get nostalgic, right? And sometimes that can be difficult, being painful, because sometimes we miss people. How many, this isn't an actual question, but how many of us actually bake things that remind us of somebody else? How many of us bake cookies or casseroles or breads or candy? We were joking recently at my family gathering around Christmas how there's this fruit cake. And then we found out that my cousin's the only one that still makes it, God bless her. My grandmother used to call it a doorstop, but she made it every year. And I don't remember which family member made it, but I think there was a part of her that thought like the ceiling would creak if she didn't make the fruit cake. Clearly, it wasn't about the fruitcake. The story that these women continue to embody are important stories. They're stories that God has been trying to get us to hear from the beginning of time. And what is the story? What are the things we're being told over and over and over again? They're all so similar, aren't they? How is it that we're called to love each other? That seems to be a pretty good theme. And love this week being our candle, we talked some last year, and I remember doing it online, and really remembering and thinking about it in a whole new way, that the love that we talk about is that abiding kind of love. Excuse me. That kind of love that sits, that you have to stand in the storm, like we've talked a lot about. The kind of love that Mary and Elizabeth had, that kind of love that called them to say yes. Hopefully we have people in our lives that have taught us things. I'm sorry. Otherwise it's going to get even worse. Hi, everybody. We're having fun here. Okay, so hopefully we have people in our lives from which we have learned other things besides just making fruitcake. Hopefully we have people in our lives that have taught us faith and how to be grounded and how to live our life. Mary not only read scripture and studied scripture, she lived by it. When she was given the opportunity, the biggest challenge of her life, when Gabriel said, you are the one that needs to carry God. She said yes, and she knew why. Her faith is what made meaning. So as we move forward, as we move towards next weekend, and we start to live into this final week of Advent, as we hustle and bustle and we read the stories of people. I was reading one story last night. There's some Christmas tree farm here in New Hampshire whose the whole family is COVID exposed and sick. And this other group of people, the whole neighborhood got together. And they're out there gathering Christmas trees, and they're out there selling them. And they're all pulling together to make sure this Christmas not only happens for the people that depend on the farm, but for the people that are at home. As we read stories about people that are driving to Kentucky, Gwen sent me a link of someone that just took their smoker and drove because all they knew how to do was to feed people. And they felt like they needed to do something. As we hear stories over and over again about how we're reaching out to people in our world. That is so amazing. But let it not just happen now. Part of the story is that we all think about it this time of year, thank God. How it is we can be there for those that are less fortunate. But how is it, like Mary, can our faith, how is it that our reading of Scripture, our prayer, how is it that that can change the way we live in January and in February? I don't know what things are going to look like. Right now, things are looking a bit ominous in the whole COVID area here in New Hampshire. But what we know is we can continue to do the next right thing. We can continue to take care of ourselves, and we can continue to care for the other. God is with us in this path. We can continue to reach out to those that understand and know, as Mary went to Elizabeth. I'm sure that each of us here have had those times, those dark times in our life when we know there was someone we could talk to, that they were the only ones that really understood. And finally, and most importantly, we know, like Mary and Elizabeth knew, that because of their belief, God continued to bless and love them. And God is going to continue to bless and love us. So as we lean into this week, let us know that as we prepare for the coming of Jesus, we know that God already lives in our hearts, in our minds, and our lives. Help us to be mindful of making room and being open and being aware of how our faith might inform for us how we might say yes as Mary does and what that might mean. Blessed, blessed are you among women, and blessed is the fruit of your womb.